Hey everyone, I'm Nathan from Arms and Armor. You know, one of the topics that gets discussed and bandied about on the internet all the time is how hard a sword blade should be. And there's this kind of idea that maybe has come over from the knife making world a little bit, that really harder is better. And this really isn't the case, right? You need a tool, and a sword's a tool, that's suited to the task at hand. So today, I'm gonna look at a chef knife, a machete, and a sword blade, and explore what kinds of qualities you want in that steel and how they hold up to sword use. It's gonna be fun. All right, so one of the first things we have to do when we're thinking about how hard a tool should be is think about what it's used for, right? This is a chef knife. This is gonna be used for preparing food, right? You want it to hold a really sharp edge for a long time because you're constantly using it for the same kind of task. This is not a tool that you should use like a utility knife, right? This steel is very hard. It's got some flex to it, right? But not tons. If you bend this beyond a certain point, it's just gonna break, right? It's gonna shatter. And this is good for this tool, right? If you use this to try and cut down a tree, you're gonna wreck it. Pretty easy. On the other hand, here's a machete, right? This machete is a low-cost tool that is for whacking against brush, right? It's an agricultural implement. You're supposed to be using it in the dirt, using it to cut down saplings. Throughout much of the Caribbean, developing parts of the world, this is a farming tool. You use it as a hoe, right? So you don't want this thing to break if it hits something hard, right? It's easy enough to put an edge on it again. If you're out in the field using it, you just have a file or a stone. You can get enough edge on it to use it the way you want. It's still spring steel, right? This is a decent machete. Many machetes are barely hardened at all. This one's pretty decent, right? It comes back to form, but it's relatively soft because you're gonna be whacking it against all kinds of stuff. Finally, we have swords, right? So this is just the blade of one of our Anglo-Saxon swords that you can probably see here. The fuller gut too thin while it was being ground. So it's a reject, but it's heat treated. It's perfectly sound. It's just not something we could sell because of this problem here, so I didn't bother mounting this or anything, but it's a heat-treated, good blade, 6150, carbon steel, right, handmade. You can see that it's got some good flex to it. It's less flexible than the machete is. This is probably harder than the machete, right? So we temper all of our swords to about 50 to 52 Rockwell, which is, in our opinion, really the perfect and ideal hardness for a sword that's gonna get used. It's actually right at the upper end of the kind of hardness that European medieval swords had, but we think it's the kind of steel that if they had picked up this sword back in the day, they would have been ecstatic at the quality of the blade, right? What are you gonna be doing with this? Well, you're going to be cutting people, right? You're gonna have sword on sword contact, you're gonna have sword on shield, or later on armor contact with these things, and you don't want it to break, right? You don't want it to bend either. You need it to keep an edge, but you really don't want it to break when it's in use, right? So that's why you don't get these things 58, 60 Rockwell. They get too brittle if you're way out there. So now I wanna do some little edge-on-edge experiments, take a look at how these different steel knives, cutting devices, weapons potentially, work in interaction with each other. All right, so what I've got here is this machete in a mill vise. It's nice and heavy on a cart, so I could wheel it in here. And I'm gonna strike this with this kitchen knife, which is a harder steel. I'm wearing safety glasses, safety third, and we'll see what happens. Woo! Look at that. That just massacred that knife. Now this knife, although it's harder steel, it's also very thin, right? This thing has a very thin edge profile, right? So one of the reasons it stays so sharp is it comes down to a very fine edge and a thin cross section. Right? If I can find the camera lens there. So it's triangular in section. That really cut into it. Now, the machete blade, I'll show that to you. So that machete also was cut into a bit, but even though this isn't as hard steel, it has a much thicker cross section, right? So it withstood that kind of impact a little better. All right, now I'm going to hit the machete with this sword blade. I don't really know what's gonna happen. Let's see. Oh, interesting. So, the blade did take a little bit of damage, not too bad. You can see that it the edge is nicked and it scratched the surface, but it didn't do that kind of gaping hole that was made in the chef knife. The machete, on the other hand, has a pretty good gash right down into it. Now, the cross section of the machete and the sword is reasonably similar, right? But the steel of the sword is significantly harder, right? So we got this real shearing cut through it. This is from the chef knife. This is from the sword. And so swords are designed for blade-on-blade contact, right? It's something that we expect will happen. That doesn't mean it's not gonna hurt them at all. Of course it is. You're taking a sharp piece of steel and smashing it against another sharp piece of steel, right? Instead, what we were trying to do, or what sword makers are trying to do, is to kind of maximize the effectiveness of the various compromises they have to make, right? Why compromises? Because you want it to hold a decent edge, that means you need it to be hard. You want it to be quite sharp, that means you need an edge that tapers, right, down to the edge reasonably, rather than, you know, being like an axe, right? Where an axe head might be quite thick and then come down to an edge in a pretty obtuse way. For a sword, typically, you want it to be a pretty acute angle on there. At the same time, you don't want it to be destroyed the first time it hits another sword, right? You don't want it to break because your life depends on this thing, right? So if it's too soft, right, it's not gonna hold its shape, it's not gonna hold an edge. If it's too hard, it's gonna break. If your edge is too thin and too fine, right, even if it's hard, it's gonna chip or it's gonna cut when you have that kind of contact, right? So all sword blades, all sword designs are a compromise between these different necessities. Sharp, but durable, right? Hard enough to hold an edge, but springy enough, soft enough, right, that it's not gonna just break in combat. I guess we might as well try chef knife against sword blade. Now, putting a sword blade in a vise, especially a sharp sword blade, is a pretty terrible idea. You have to be really careful about these things. We've had incidents at the shop over the years, right? Kind of our only accidental running through that happened to one of our employees was when there was a blade in a vise. So be careful if you're gonna mess around with this kind of thing. All right, let's see how this works on the sword blade. That was pretty cool. You can see that a big chunk is taken out of it that connects to the previous chop. It ended up actually just breaking the knife. What about the sword? So here is the nick from the knife, right? It's pretty shallow, it's just on the edge. Again, it's scratched further up the blade, but it's just the nick in the edge. It's actually the problem, right? So you can see this whole section down here, that's just superficial scratching. This is the actual damage, right? So the sword blade, unsurprisingly, holds up better against the kinds of circumstances that a sword is going to encounter, while a chef knife and a machete fare less well. All right, guys, thanks a lot.